Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Nice to see all of you on a beautiful San Diego evening. I'm just back from a quick trip to New York for the Tony Awards, where our production of Bright Star was nominated for 5 Tonys. Yes, indeed. And as Steve Martin said when the show finished, he said, "We went 5 for 5!" So, yeah, didn't quite turn out the way we all had hoped, but it was a lovely night. And I couldn't be happier to fly back into town for this really wonderful event, to share the stage with a great thinker and a great friend. As all of you know, 2016 is the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death, or as I prefer to think of it, the 400th birthday of his posthumous reputation. And Shakespeare institutions all over the world are commemorating this anniversary by pulling out the stops. And San Diego is in the middle of a Shakespeare Palooza. The Globe, in addition to this magnificent San Diego Public Library, all 3 San Diego major universities, the City of San Diego Commission for Arts and Culture, and KPBS have partnered to present a month of programming to celebrate Shakespeare, in particular to celebrate the First Folio, which is upstairs on the 9th floor of the building across the way. The First Folio of 1623, of course, is the first complete works of Shakespeare. In it are 18 plays that had never been published before and would likely have been lost without that publication, and so it is the book that gave us Shakespeare. And the great Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C., has done the extraordinary gesture of sending a copy of the First Folio around to each of the 50 states during this year to celebrate this publication and to commemorate Shakespeare's death. And this building and San Diego and the Globe and the library, the only place in the entire state of California where this traveling exhibition is showing up. So we're very thrilled about that. It also gives me an opportunity to extend some of the normal programming that we do to this Shakespeare celebration. And that includes this series. I do something called In Conversation, in which whenever we have a luminary passing through town, and none are as luminous as my friend Brian, I take the opportunity to talk with them publicly about what they do. And that's what we're going to do here for tonight. We'll chat for a little while and then take some of your questions. Brian Kulick is finishing his final year as artistic director of Classic Stage Company, one of the gems of New York City. It's on 13th Street, just off of Union Square, a theater he has led since 2003 when some bum left the place, namely me. And Brian succeeded me and has done just amazing, amazing, amazing things there. This season alone, he directed Brecht's Mother Courage and Her Children, and Lessing's rarely seen, amazing, wonderful play Nathan the Wise, starring F. Murray Abraham. Also there, he has directed Ostrovsky's The Forest with Diane Wiest, Shakespeare's The Tempest with Mandy Patinkin, Hamlet, Richard II, Richard III with the great Michael Cumpsty. He has done readings of Brecht's Galileo, The Caucasian Chalk Circle. He produced Classic Stage Company's very celebrated Chekhov cycle, including all 5 of Chekhov's major plays, with an amazing group of artists, including Alan Cumming, Maggie Gyllenhaal, Ethan Hawke, Dennis O'Hare, Jolie Richardson, Peter Sarsgaard, John Turturro, Diane Wiest. He's just done extraordinary things at CSC. Prior to that, he was an artistic associate and then associate producer of the Public Theater, where he directed Twelfth Night, The Winter's Tale, and Timon of Athens in the famous Shakespeare in the Park in Central Park. I saw all 3 of them, and they were completely wonderful. He has directed at the great theaters all over New York City in the United States, and he teaches in the graduate directing program at Columbia University. Ladies and gentlemen, Brian Kulick. Thank you. Well, Brian, welcome to San Diego. You've been here, what, 4 weeks?
4 weeks.
4 weeks.
And it's been amazing.
Brian is here directing Macbeth. We're allowed to say that because it's not a theater, so that's all right. And he just finished the studio phase of the rehearsal process, and the technical rehearsals out on our outdoor stage begin very soon. I saw a run-through of it. It's fantastic. Just let me ask you your impressions of San Diego. You're a Southern California boy.
Yeah, I'm originally from Long Beach, Los Alamitos, California. But my family is travel adverse. So even the idea of going to San Diego, which seems like, what's the issue? Just didn't happen. But I would constantly, as a kid, voraciously read in the papers about the Old Globe and all the amazing work. So I have to pinch myself just about once a day that I'm actually at the Old Globe directing a Shakespeare piece, because this is one of the great institutions that has kept the idea of a very particular, almost American idea of inventive Shakespeare alive for now how
81 years.
unbelievable. It's an unbelievable legacy, and to just be just to ride the coattails of that is couldn't be happier.
And are you enjoying being back in Southern California, just experientially?
It's great. I've now lived in New York City for 20 years, and I'm still not used to it. There's something about, you can just sit and be still for a second in California, and you can feel nature, you can feel the desert, you can feel weather, but if you can't sit still in New York. There's no place to sit still in New York. There's this sort of constant hubbub. So I find it incredibly hard actually to work, and I'm amazed that so many artists actually do their work outside of New York and then come and show their work. But actually to work in New York I find to be very difficult. This is much more conducive. I don't know do you feel that?
Yeah, there's one of the things I find working here is how much more productive a day is.
Oh my God.
Because there are just that energy that you described, it takes a toll on everybody's psyche and demands a lot of space, And here, it's just a little quieter, and certainly in the middle of Balboa Park, it's calm and lovely, if not quiet all the time. And I do find that the average rehearsal day just somehow seems more productive.
Human.
Yeah.
I remember walking one day out of the public theater, and I was walking down the street, and I go, "What is that sound? What is that sound? It's growling. I'm growling. I'm literally walking, going, just from all the tension. I haven't had one growling day in San Diego."
That's a great story. Yeah, that's true. I get it. I totally get it. So let's talk a little bit about Shakespeare. You've done so much Shakespeare, and at such a very, very high level. And I've admired your Shakespeare in the massive space of the Delacorte Theater in the middle of Central Park, and in the very intimate space of Classic Stage Company. Classic Stage Company is in a building that was in the 19th century a livery stable. So it's on 13th Street. 14th Street in the 19th century was the posh street of Lower Manhattan. And so there were mansions there, and the horses were kept one street down on 13th Street. And most of these 19th century buildings in New York City are gone. And Classic Stage Company's home is a really prime example of what a 19th century stable looked like. You go in there and there's beautiful wood timbers overhead, and the room itself, because it's old and wooden, has the sound of the inside of a violin. It's just got a wonderful, intimate, warm sort of feeling. It's a gem of a space. And the two of us are, if I may say, profoundly lucky to have had long associations with that space. It's about the size of the Cheryl and Harvey White Theater at the Globe. For those of you who've been there, seats only 180. So Brian's done Shakespeare in an intimate situation like that, the vast 2,000-seat arena in the middle of Central Park, and now our 620 or so seat festival stage out in Balboa Park. Let me ask you just some broad, if I may, Brian, broad questions about your approach to Shakespeare. So you decide as a producer, or a producer like me calls you and says, "Would you like to do this play?" Where do you start? Where do you start? You start by reading the play? Do you start by reading around the play? Do you look at other productions of the play? What's the first thing you do?
Oh, that's a great question. It's changed over the years, but nowadays, to me, the first thing is, what is the play? What is it really? What is it really about? And trying to understand. Peter Brook sometimes uses the word "the secret play." That there's this play, there's a plot, but there's also a story underneath. And sometimes the plot is just an excuse to smuggle a subversive story or a subliminal story to an audience. And so I'm very curious to try to understand, if I can understand what the story is, but sometimes that doesn't happen when you're sitting reading alone. So sometimes it doesn't happen when you're in a rehearsal room. Sometimes it doesn't happen until you're in front of an audience and you realize, oh, that's what it's really about. So part of it is trying to figure out what is the secret. What's the secret of the play? And then does that secret really rhyme with what's going on today? Because I'm a big believer that I love art and I love theater, but I'm not interested in art for art's sake or theater for theater's sake. I think it needs to rhyme, something from the past, which I'm very interested in, needs to rhyme with the present. And when that happens, when I can find that rhyme, I get very excited, because then suddenly 400 years collapses and the piece feels, and that's the magic of Shakespeare, is how no matter how much time is between ourselves and this incredible artist, it can feel immediate, it can feel right now.
Yeah, do you mean by that rhyme something? So, for example, you're doing Macbeth, ambition. Do you mean thematic concerns of the play, or do you have something else in mind?
It can be, it can be many different things. Sometimes the rhyme is a secret rhyme. Like I'll tell a secret. I shouldn't tell this, and please don't pass it on beyond this room. When I was doing Winter's Tale, I had to figure out what does it mean to me, and I thought about the king, Leontes, as my boss, the artistic director, George Wolfe, who I loved, but I felt he was kind of not taking care of the institution the way he should take care of the institution. And it was sort of like the institution was Hermione. So I could make this substitution that George Wolfe was Leontes and the public theater was Hermione, and all the courtiers were the staff. And suddenly, when I was able to do that, on a personal level, the play snapped into focus, and I could engage in it in a very human way. And because I love George and was also angry at George, so do you know what I'm saying? It was balanced. It wasn't like putting a black hat on an artistic director. That's a very personal. That's a very personal version of.
Yeah, that's great. Where does scholarship and other people's thinking about these plays come in?
Well, then there's a period where I think you have to, if trying to do due diligence, you want to read around the topic and you want to go, and so there's been a period in my life where if, I'm asked to given the gift of doing something like Macbeth, then you feel like I got to read all the scholarship around it. And the interesting thing about doing that is there isn't necessarily one scholar who gets it right, who nails it, but what you really start to feel is that there's a constellation of scholars, of people who've experienced the play, and they become like they become a way to navigate. They become like stars at night, and you can sort of guide your sort of interpretational ship using them to sort of help orient you, find your longitude and latitude. So,
how much do you read? Do you read less than you did 20 years ago when you're directing? Do you read more?
I set a goal for myself, which I don't do anymore. But because when you do Hamlet, you have a nervous breakdown. When you say you're going to do Hamlet, you have a nervous breakdown. So in my nervous breakdown, one of the things I said I was going to do, and you're also horrible to your loved ones. I was, it was a terrible time. But I decided I will read everything that's ever been written on Hamlet. That was a lot, and I was crazy enough, and I had the time. I don't have that time anymore, but I had the time to actually read like 25, books, and there was a lot of scholarship on Hamlet. So, and you can get lost in the thicket of that as well. I mean, that becomes another problem.
Yeah, it becomes a screen, right?
Yeah.
I mean, how do you survive all those other people's ideas about the play?
Something will, it's like breadcrumbs. Something in each person will fall before you, and you go, oh, and then you'll see someone else's breadcrumb, and slowly you start to find things. But also you realize that, as great as scholars are, and there are some unbelievable, Frank Kermode. I mean, the list is G. Wilson Knight. I mean, the list is endless of great Shakespearean scholars. But you realize that, it's such a big universe. These plays are so huge that they will always, no matter what your interpretation is, the play will always exceed the interpretation. And that's what makes them great. That's why we can keep doing them over and over again. That's why audiences can collect Hamlets. That's why you can go, Jan Kott very famously said, there are 5 Hamlets embedded in Hamlet. There's a thriller, there's a psychological expose, there's a critique on metaphysics, there's a meta-theatrical, there's a political agenda. They're all wrapped in there. A director can't do all of them. You really only can do one, and maybe get flavors of the other. So, in that respect, I think you can return to a Hamlet and keep rediscovering the play in interesting ways.
Do you find that you're consciously aware of the legacy of other people's productions of the plays?
Sometimes, like I couldn't touch, for instance, Peter Brook's Midsummer Night's Dream. That's a play that is beyond, I think it's like, that was the production. I don't know what else to do with it.
Right.
I'm trying to think if there's...
But as you go through a play like God, Hamlet, one of the things you find out is, here's what Olivier did so brilliantly. Here's what, Kenneth Branagh did. Here's what Kevin Kline did. It's all there,
yeah.
So do you feel that you have to respond to that in some way?
Oh, that's a great question. I think, casting is, I'm going to sort of go off your question for a second.
Please.
And try to come back.
Sure.
I think when who you cast as Hamlet is part of your interpretation. If you cast someone, you can cast a revenger, you can cast someone young and philosophical. Whoever you cast, that's part of your interpretation. You really have to work the part to who that person is. So my first, I had a choice when I was doing Hamlet between an actor who was very feeling, very, 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 very emotive, and you would cry when he died. And then I had the opportunity of an actor who was much more heady, so you'd really get the philosophical argument. And then an actor who was just really felt like Burbage, felt like what a Renaissance actor would be, just like kind of ferocious in a way. Almost like, oh yeah, that's why they also use the theater as a bear baiting. This guy could like stand up to a bear. Those are 3 very different Hamlets. And you can't force the one actor who's philosophical to be emotive. You can't, an actor is wired a very particular way. So I guess what I'm saying is a big part of the job is when you decide, okay, that's my Hamlet, then you have to build that production around that person. And then within that comes your question, which is huge, which is how does that sit? What is your Hamlet bringing that is slightly different than the pantheon of Hamlets that have preceded it? And that's part of the excitement of it is that these plays are so rich, the roles are so wonderfully mysterious, that there's always something new to discover in these characters.
Yeah, one of the things I love about working here is that I know the audience is going to get the play again in a decade. I mean, I've been here almost 4 years. We've done 14 Shakespeare plays, right? So that means we're going to take the Globe 9 years at the rate we're going. We're doing 2 in the summer, and we're doing 1 in our Globe for All touring thing, and 1 in our MFA acting program, 4. There's 36 of them, so takes a decade to make it through before we go back in the cycle again. And that makes me feel like it doesn't have to be definitive each and every time.
Right.
It'll be the Hamlet of the early 21st century, and then 10 years later, there'll be another Hamlet that'll come through town. And I found that for the first time when I was a graduate student in England, is that the plays were coming around every 2-3 years. The artistic directors of the great English theaters would get together and declare moratoria on certain of them, just because they were coming up so frequently, But it does lift this burden of feeling like it's got to be perfect, I find. It's nice to feel like you're just part of a continuum, and you're just adding one new link to the chain. You know, I remember when we did the Pacino Merchant of Venice. You know, Pacino's Shylock just moved the ball a little bit. He did some things that nobody had done, and it moved it forward a little bit. And it was such a wonderful feeling to feel that you were doing that, adding to the great eternal chain of great actors playing Shylock. And 10 years from now, whoever the next great guy is going to come up, and he'll refer not only to 400 years of Shylocks that we know about before that, but also to Al Pacino's. And there's this accretion of a tradition.
Yeah, no, it's the closest theater comes to opera, you know, where you can go and you can listen to, you know, when you have a great Shakespearean, you know, like Kevin Kline, and also how they handle language changes. You know, not only interpretation but the whole presentation can change radically as a result of that. But you can really sort of collect your Hamlets. I sort of feel like it's like baseball cards, you know.
Yeah. So let me pick up on that. So the way they handle language. So we're 100 yards from the first folio sitting here. How deep is your textual scholarship? How do you prepare one of these things?
Not as deep as yours.
Well, that's kind of
No. You know, you're sitting here. I feel sort of chagrined because I should be interviewing Barry. I mean, this is an extraordinary artist, and you all should read his book, Thinking Shakespeare, which is one of the clearest explications of how Shakespeare's language works theatrically and humanly. It's an extraordinary book.
Thank you, Brian. So now tell me. I mean, I'll ask you a very simple, straightforward question. We'll go out from there. Do you cut the text yourself?
Yes.
So nobody does Shakespeare uncut. You can't do Hamlet uncut. Even Macbeth, which is a short play, and has been, we believe, the text that we have is a text that was cut by Thomas Middleton and then went into the first folio. It has that feeling of somebody who really knew what they were doing, chopping all the fat out of it, but you still cut it, right? Yeah. So you do it. You don't hire a dramaturg to do it. No. And what's that like? What do? You download a text from the internet and type? You know, I mean, I do. Yeah. The Folger library, bless them, has digital copies of all the Shakespeare texts, and you can get it as a PDF, you can get it as a Word document, you can get it as HTML, a well-edited, clean text. You download it, and then you just start cutting and changing it.
Yeah. Well, I've lost my mind. So you're looking at a crazy person. I've become very obsessed with the folio, with the punctuation that's in the folio, which is compositor's punctuation.
Yes,
you know.
Right, not Shakespeare.
So the first thing I want is, nowadays, I need a modern printed facsimile of the folio edition. I do believe that the folio is the final statement of the theatrical company's feeling about the play, not necessarily Shakespeare's, but you know the stories, the difference between the quartos and the folios. A general theory, which is probably just a myth, is that the quartos are closer to what Shakespeare wanted when he went into rehearsal, and the folio is probably pretty much what the company decided it should be after maybe doing it at the Globe, maybe taking it on the road, maybe taking it to court. All these different things start. Burbage going, I can't do this, Will. You know, I need a fourth act to just rest. Leave me alone. You know, these sorts of things. So the first thing I'm curious about is to look at the folio and then compare it with the quarto. And there's very big problems that start to emerge when you start to do that. In doing Richard III, there's a famous line where Richard says, and I'm terrible, I have to paraphrase part of it, you know, I, Richard, a villain. When I was going to school, the line was, I am I. Richard the villain, I am I. That was the standard reading of that line. That's the quarto version. The folio version is, I am Richard a villain, I and not I. Nowadays, believe it or not, now scholars feel that I and not I is correct, and I am I is incorrect. And their theory is accept the stranger choice, because they feel like the compositors sometimes will
normalize
because they think, oh, he can't possibly mean that.
Yeah.
And then they try to simplify it. So when you think about this moment where Richard is contemplating, is he a villain? You could say that he's looking in a mirror and he's saying, this mirror image, and not I. So that there's a schizophrenic break that happens. So one of the first the first phase of work is to try to
read the period texts.
Is to read both texts.
Yeah.
And all, because there's huge things. Another example, stop me if this is boring, because I could just go on and on about this sort of stuff. In Twelfth Night, at the end of the play, Sir Toby Belch is confronted with Sir Andrew Aguecheek, and Sir Andrew forgives him, and Sir Toby goes on and says, you scoundrel, you this, you that, he says all these terrible things. In the quarto version, it sounds as though Sir Toby is criticizing Sir Andrew Aguecheek. In the folio version, it's a question, as if you still would love me even though I'm a scoundrel, I'm this, I'm that, I'm that. That the whole role of Sir Toby Belch is defined by which choice you make, whether at the end of the play he castigates his friend, or whether at the end of the play he reconnects with his friend and realizes that he's not been a good human being. It's two very different Sir Tobys.
I've been deep, obviously I've been deep in, beg your pardon, the folio and all the textual implications of it, getting ready for this extraordinary thing to happen here in San Diego. And you do come away, this is my view anyway, is that you come away with a sense that there's no such thing as a definitive text.
Yeah.
There's only versions. There are the versions that were printed during Shakespeare's lifetime in the case of half the plays. There's the version in which the folio is the first publication, and we know of all these problems, mechanical problems. They ran, the letters broke as the pressure of the printing press repeatedly came on them, and as the letters broke apart, the spellings started to change as the letters changed form. They jammed things together on the page to make it fit. And so the idea of the text as coming out of Shakespeare's fingertip with fire and being etched into stone permanently just disappears. And you feel like it's a collaborative human activity to get these texts to survive. And therefore we can enter into them in the same spirit.
And I think that's part of the DNA. That's part of the DNA of Shakespeare, is that on a cellular level, it's a big erector set in which every theatrical company has to slightly rearrange and torque for their time, and that's part of the beauty of it.
And not to go too far in the weeds of this, but one of the big contentious questions in the academic world of Shakespeare at the moment is, did Shakespeare revise his plays? Because, to take just one quick example, the death of King Lear in the quarto publication, in the early publication from 1608 when Shakespeare was alive, and the death of King Lear in the 1623 First Folio are completely different. In the earlier text, Lear dies convinced that his daughter Cordelia is dead, and his last line is, "Break, heart, I prithee, break." In the folio, that line goes to somebody else who's watching the whole thing, says, "Break, heart, I prithee, break," and Lear dies convinced that Cordelia is still alive. Look there, look on her lips, look there, and it's this sentimental, emotional, he dies a happy man. And wrongly, because she is dead, but he dies thinking that she's still alive.
Yeah, if I can add on to that.
Please.
I think, my favorite line, if I had to distill all Shakespeare into a t-shirt, into one thing, it would be the line from Kent where he says to Lear, after the first scene, "See better." And I actually think one of the great moments of all Shakespeare is that moment that Barry's alluding to, when he sees Cordelia breathe. He actually is seeing Cordelia breathe, because the actress isn't dead, she's breathing. So here you actually have a Pirandellian moment where he is actually doing what Kent is saying. He's actually seeing better. He's seeing the metatheatrics. He's seeing beyond what other people can see. So
yes,
I think that's
extraordinary, right? Now, but again, we don't know what accounts for the fact that there's one version in 1608 and another version in 1623. We just don't know. one theory is Shakespeare revised the play. They took the really bleak, airless version, they did it, they performed it, as Brian said, they took it on the road, and they all realized that's just too much. We've got to figure out a different ending that allows the audience to breathe a little and release some emotion, and so he rewrites it. But there's no documentary evidence of that fact, and there is a faction of scholarship that simply resists anything that can't be proven, A, since we can't document that Shakespeare revised the plays, we can't say that he did, and B, that has a lot invested in Shakespeare as a perfect being, and therefore the idea that he would change his mind and change something is difficult. And right up until just now, I mean, 2 months ago, a great English scholar named Sir Brian Vickers wrote a book refuting the Shakespeare is reviser theory. When I was in graduate school in the 80s, that was the birth of the Shakespeare is reviser theory, when the Oxford Shakespeare was published in 1986, and everybody said, oh yeah, Shakespeare revises plays, and guys like me and Brian, who work with playwrights all the time, accept that playwrights revise their plays. That's just, in the theater world, it's non-controversial. Of course he revised his plays. That's what you do. You're constantly working to make it better. But it was revolutionary in the 80s, the idea that Shakespeare was a reviser. It's now the conventional wisdom. Now Brian Vickers publishes a book saying that's all hogwash. It's called The One King Lear, in which he refutes the whole revision theory by talking about practices in the printing house. Another scholar did something unprecedented and criticized Vickers' book via Twitter, put out, as he was reading, 500 tweets, just eviscerating Brian Vickers' theory about the One King Lear. So this weird subject of how do we account for two different endings of King Lear is really pretty much the most controversial thing in academic Shakespeare at the moment.
One of the things that's interesting that Barry is touching on is that there's been two parallel worlds that have, there's been the world of theater practice and there's the world of scholarly interpretation. But now that there's so much Shakespeare being produced in the world, I think scholars are realizing that there's a lot to be learned by theater practice, something that they just weren't familiar with. And so this idea of Shakespeare the reviser makes sense because that's the way theater has always been made. But you can now see more and more scholars spending time in rehearsal rooms, being dramaturgs, and gaining a lot more knowledge about how Shakespeare may have made these plays just by seeing how a rehearsal process unfolds and how cuts get.
Yeah, well, just 2 weeks ago, James Shapiro was sitting in the chair you're sitting in.
My chagrin. Did I tell you this?
No.
Oh my God. So I did a terrible thing. I've done something really terrible, and I changed a whole bunch of stuff in one of the scenes, and I was literally thinking, what would a Shakespeare scholar think if they sat there and saw that? And I turned around, and sitting back there was James Shapiro, one of the great Shakespearean scholars of all time. And I thought, I am toast. First of all, I thought I lost my mind, and
that he wasn't really there.
He wasn't really there.
The ghost of Hamlet's father.
Yeah. Banquo has arrived to.
Yeah.
And then when I realized he wouldn't go away when I rubbed my eyes, I said, James, should I not do this? And God bless him, he said, no, that's actually very interesting. That speech has never made sense. And I think this is an interesting way to parse that out. So,
that's great.
But it was a real, very sobering moment.
Now, and he is, on the staff of the Public Theater. He's the resident Shakespeare scholar of the Public Theater. So there is this extraordinary crossover. 20 years ago, when I was in graduate school, that would have been imaginable. That the greatest unimaginable, that the greatest Shakespeare scholar of his day would be a paid staff member at a theater company that produces Shakespeare. Just unheard of. So really, one of the huge changes in our working lifetime has been the breach of this impermeable wall between Shakespeare scholarship and Shakespearean theatrical practice,
And it's been rewarding for both sides of one.
Absolutely both sides. I think that still some of Jim's colleagues look at him a little bit sideways, What are you doing there? What are you doing there?
Slumming.
Slumming it a little bit. No, and he's been a real pioneer. Teaches at Columbia, where you also are on the faculty. Do you run into him? Do you have much to do with him?
Our sons were taking swimming lessons at the same time, so that's
really?
So that's how we got to spend time with each other.
Not in the faculty
Not in the
lounge.
faculty lounge,
No,
in the
but
pool,
at the pool.
with the chlorine, in the locker room.
That's great. Let's talk a little bit about your Macbeth. As I mentioned, I saw a run-through of it the other day. It's really interesting and quite brilliantly conceived. Now, I always describe to my audience that there are two basic approaches to Shakespeare productions. I call them the simile production and the metaphor production. Simile production is when a director says, I think that the world of The Merry Wives of Windsor is like the world of a 50s sitcom. Or I think that the world of Much Ado About Nothing is like the world of, in a famous example, the colonial Raj in India. And so then the production sets up a series of simile-like comparisons where Dogberry and Verges are local Indian constables who go to work for the British overlord and so on. And it's just all neatly one thing compared to the other. That's the simile production of Shakespeare. Then there's the metaphor production of Shakespeare, where you're making a world that bears an evocative, metaphoric relationship to the world in the play, and borrowing from many, many places to try and express in a more poetic and, as I say, evocative way what the play is about. I've done both. You've done both, I think, of the ones that I've seen. Here, you're in a kind of World War I world and dealing in particular with what then was called shell shock and what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. But on the other hand, you're not being slavish to World War I. It's not like there's some tank that comes rolling through in the middle of the play or something like that. Right. It's not a literal version of World War I at all. It's kind of a borrowing metaphoric meaning from World War I and using that to express the deep psychology of this text. Is that fair?
I think so, yes. Yeah.
So where does that, just where's that clue in? At some point when I called you, I said, would you like to do Macbeth? And you said, wow, let me think about the play. Suddenly you tell me, yeah, I'm thinking World War I, I'm thinking PTSD, I'm thinking, how does a connection get made?
Sure. To me, I've said this to Barry and other people. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. The issue with Macbeth is, what do you do with those witches? Who are they? And whenever directors get together and one director says to another director, I'm doing Macbeth, the first question the other director goes, what are you doing with the witches? That's
absolutely.
It's a big issue because there's the stereotype in your head, right, with the cauldron and they're stirring things up, which can be fabulous. But I think when you ask that question, what you're really asking is, what is evil? Is evil metaphysical? Is evil biological? Is evil socially constructed? And I think you have to ask yourself, as a director, what do you feel and what do you think speaks to your society? I don't believe in metaphysical evil. I'm wildly superstitious, but I don't believe in metaphysical evil. I don't even necessarily believe in biological evil, although I know that people missing certain genes can behave a certain way because of the loss of one gene or one part of a chromosome. But I do think that evil can be socially constructed. And I think there are circumstances that create, that become a hothouse for evil to happen. One of those places is war. and war is something that is unfortunately sometimes a necessity, cannot be avoided. And one of the most tragic parts of what war does is what it does to those who fight, what it does to their minds, what it does to their souls, what they bring back with them. So once I sort of tried to be very honest with, excuse me, how do I?
Let me give you some more water.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Because, what is evil? Once I answered that question for myself, then I just try to tease that through. Well, how would what world would be a world? So a VA hospital. What if we're in a VA hospital? What if all the people you meet at the beginning of the play are in this hospital? Macbeth is in the hospital, recuperating from having unseen the man from the nave to the chops. What if the witches are patients in this hospital? What if that becomes the seed ground for this? And
So hospital pops into your hospital suddenly shows up. Psychiatric ward of an army hospital pops into your brain,
right.
and it seems right.
It felt like there's something. It felt like I could do something with it. In tandem with that, there's a very interesting book by a Bulgarian theoretician. His last name is Todorov. He wrote a fantastic book, which is called The Fantastic. It's about supernatural. It's about why we get excited with supernatural stories. And one of the things that he says, when a supernatural story really works, when you look at Poe, when you look at Stephen King, when you look at a Twilight Zone episode, he says that what we're interested in is this: is it really happening? Is that really evil? Or is that really a witch? Or is that just a projection? And what Todorov says is, no matter how it's answered is disappointing. If you get to the end and she really was a witch, you're disappointed. And if you get to the end and it's like, no, it was in his mind, you're disappointed. He said the thing about the supernatural is it touches that point that we have almost every day, a moment where we wonder, is this happening or is this a figment of my imagination? And so Todorov was interested in this idea of how long can you suspend the idea of what is going on before you have to make the decision, is she a witch or not a witch? And so I became very interested in that idea of could I keep that question afloat so that everything you're seeing, you could ask yourself, is it really happening or is it just happening in Macbeth's mind? And try to keep that tension alive throughout.
And the production very, very successfully does. You're also blessed with an actor who can really walk that line in Jonathan Cake. Yeah. Fantastic. We're so lucky to have him. Amazing British, unusually for us, British classical actor with an amazingly long line of classical stage roles. Also a deeply handsome man, which doesn't hurt. And he's done an amazing job actually navigating this line. Now let me ask you something else. You know, you are possessed of an extraordinary mind, great mind. I'm going to embarrass you by telling you that your friend, the great Tony Kushner, says that you have the finest mind in the American theater. That's quite something.
Well,
when Tony Kushner says that. No. He said it about you. And one of the things I adore about Brian is the range of his references. And I say this in the best possible way, the professorial cast of his mind. But Shakespeare directors come in different camps. There are showmen, our own precious, wonderful Jack O'Brien, whose instincts with Shakespeare are those of a showman, a Broadway musical theater director. And the intellectual armature is somewhere else in there, but not the first note. And here you are leading with this very, very sophisticated discussion of metaphysics and Bulgarian academics that you're reading, right?
It's a fantastic book.
But the show has a wonderful sense of theatrical verve, and you're not above a dumb joke.
Oh, no, I'm a joke whore.
Yeah, so, So let me ask you about that. To me, and I'm asking purely for my own personal edification, because it is this double identity that I find I'm dealing with when I'm in the rehearsal room with Shakespeare, which is there is this monumental intellectual puzzle that requires a kind of purely intellectual, intelligent, analytical mind to solve. And then there's stuff like, it's got to go faster, or it'd be better if they're standing instead of sitting, and there's just pure bravura showmanship. So what's that combination for you?
Well, I think having the great opportunity to spend now a decade working on, a little over, about 15 years working on Shakespeare, I've learned a tremendous amount about theater making from Shakespeare. You know, Shakespeare is based on, in a given line, a fundamental juxtaposition or an antithesis, you know. And what I found is that the antithesis that Shakespeare wields in a line or a sentence, you know, where he's juggling opposites, fair and foul, you know, and is how he not only constructs, a sentence, but how he constructs a scene, how he constructs an act, how he constructs the first part, is that you realize that everything that's happening in Shakespeare's language, the idea of caesura, all of these things that happen in the language are actually happening in the theatrical unfolding. So the micro level can continually inform the macro level. So one of the things that I love is to really exploit difference. Shakespeare is the great machine of difference, so that you can have something that's really funny followed by something that's really sad. And where I get excited is to not blend. A lot of sometimes directing, you feel like, oh, it's too much, it's too funny, it's too sad. I've got to blend it together into funny sad. But actually, no, Shakespeare's life doesn't work that way. Life is really funny, and then it's really serious, and then it's something else. And so you can learn a lot about how reality works and how theater works by the way Shakespeare will put a quiet scene next to a noisy scene. And then the joy is to celebrate the quietness and then luxuriate in the noise of the next scene and explode the opposites. So a lot of what I'm just trying to do is really sort of on a conducting level, is try to do that imagistically and energistically, what's in the text itself. Does that make
sense? See it in your practice.
You know, and also the idea of caesura. You know, in a Shakespeare line, you can get so much momentum that there can be this little still point, sometimes in the middle of the line, sometimes in the middle of the speech. He creates caesura scenes. You know, he earns so much energy from plot that he can have a scene like Henry V just wandering around disguised, listening to what other people think about him. Or he can have a scene where Hamlet sits with the clowns and they talk about skulls. These are caesura scenes. These are scenes that they don't forward the plot, but they somehow are necessary. They give you a rest. They allow your mind to expand for a moment, and then the story picks up again. The plot picks up again. So there's so much in Shakespeare's use of language, literal language, that can then be understand that there's a theatrical language that functions in the same exact way.
One of the things that is fun having you here, Brian, because I've seen so much of your Shakespeare work over that 15-year period, is to see things that are variations of things that I've seen you do. Right? Brian did a wonderful production of Timon of Athens, a Shakespeare rarity, and of all places, Shakespeare in the Park. You know, what a crazy idea that was. And there's very brilliant, sort of famous sequence of a bunch of guys at a banquet. It's Timon is this rich guy. He's been incredibly philanthropic. People have been fleecing him, just taking this rich guy and taking him to the cleaners. Suddenly, mysteriously, inexplicably, he goes broke. So he goes to each of the guys he's helped and asks them for a loan. They all have some weaselly reason why they can't help him with money. So he becomes infuriated. And to exact revenge, he hatches this crazy plot, which is he's going to send word out that he's going to have one last blowout decadent party like all these guys used to love at his house. So they come over for a banquet, and he serves them hot water and rocks, and then curses them, and starts throwing things at them. And then he runs off to the woods and lives as a hermit misanthrope until he dies. Crazy, strange play. The banquet scene that you did in the Delacorte Theater is the size of a baseball field. It's huge. So I think if I'm not mistaken, it's the largest stage by square footage in the United States of America. And so there was this long banquet table. It was on wheels, and these guys were on chairs. And when Timon started going crazy, he pushed the table around. And so this long thing, must have been 30 feet long, starts spinning around, and these guys are holding on chairs on wheels. And then eventually somebody would let go and go off to the side. Just the most remarkable thing, you know? And thank God nobody filmed it. It lives in my mind in the most brilliant way. I remember seeing it and just going, wow, that's incredible. I've never seen anything like it. And there's a reprise of it in this Scottish play. Not the same thing, but there's a long banquet table.
Yes,
it goes spinning around.
Yeah,
a couple guys go twirling off on chairs, and I was so happy to see it again. I really was. And so happy that San Diego, who didn't get to see that Timon of Athens, is going to get to see the trademark Brian Kulick banquet table spin.
It's
a thing.
You're absolutely
Yeah,
right.
so talk about that. Talk about raiding, because Shakespeare does it all the time. He goes back to an idea that he had 5 years ago, 10 years ago, right? Famously, in many, many cases, the whole first half of Othello is a repeat of the first half of Much Ado About Nothing. Scene by scene, it just comes out nastier in the tragedy than it does in the comedy. But structurally, the two plays are the same. And separated by 8-9 years, he just goes back to tease something out again. Is that what's up here? Is that what's up?
The Timon was a wonderful happy accident. A lot of times the best things that happen are accidents. We had wanted some stage machinery to happen, and it was impossible. It cost too much money. So the actors, I said, we can't do this, and the actors said, well, we can approximate it. We can figure it out. And in the room, and the great thing about rehearsing is we all sort of figured this thing out. And then it's. It worked really well, and people, that's when they think about Timon of Athens. That's what most people go. Oh, the table spun and the chairs, and this is what I've wrought. And so then you think, oh, I can't repeat myself. I shouldn't repeat myself. It's wrong to repeat yourself. You're sloppy, or you're being terrible if you repeat yourself. But when I got to I did, and I learned that because the next year I did a circular table that spun, and it was just not good. So I just thought I can't do this anymore, and that's God telling me that I shouldn't repeat myself, because you gotta, but the energy, in some ways, what's so interesting is the energy of Timon and the energy of Macbeth are very similar. It's a very, and so when we got to the banquet scene...
Yeah, we know why, because they were both written
cut
by Thomas Middleton. Yeah.
There's a collaborator working there who has a much more, has a more, I don't know, how would you describe it? He's just a trickster,
Yeah, he's a showbiz. He's a guy who knows how to make stuff work. Thomas Middleton is one of the dozens of playwrights who had a major professional career and had the misfortune of doing so at the same time as William Shakespeare. And so posterity doesn't remember them. Every once in a while they're produced. Middleton has a fantastic masterpiece of a play called Women Beware Women, and frequently produced. It's wonderful. I had a chance to direct it many, many years ago. But one of the things that he became in Shakespeare's company was a script doctor, and he would fix stuff up. And he did that with Timon of Athens. He did that with Macbeth. He did that with Measure for Measure, some, perhaps others. And you feel a real craftsman's mind at work. An enemy of fat, an enemy of excess. And these Middleton plays of Shakespeare's move in a very different way from the plays in the rest of the canon that feel like Middleton's plays. He wrote a whole series of basically sitcoms. We call them the city comedies. They're these goofball plays that take place in the city of London among the bourgeois. And they're very, very, very funny. And they work like a Seinfeld episode. They have the energy, the drive of a contemporary situation comedy. And he brought that to these Shakespeare plays.
And there's something in Middleton. He's nastier than Shakespeare. Shakespeare, I think, is a great humanist. I mean that when you deal with Shakespeare, you can see that no matter how shitty a human being you are, if you have to die, you get a great speech. You know, you can be the most awful human being in the world, and you get a great speech at the end. He can't hate people. You know, it's almost impossible for Shakespeare not to sympathize. Not so with Middleton. And so you have this anarchic energy that's been allowed inside the humanism of Shakespeare. And so I find that a lot of things that I'm doing in Macbeth are rememberings of Timon because the energy is similar.
That's so fascinating. Yeah.
Anyway. So
I see a PhD thesis.
Oh no, please.
Coming up.
No, but it is, you know, directing is just it's more like conducting. It's about trying to get a certain kind of energistic rhythm going, and then an image pool that sort of can support that, and so in this instance, the play just keeps bringing me back to Timon in that respect.
That's great. Well, God knows the memorable production, as is this one. Before we open it up to the floor, I want to ask you about a different subject, which is your life as a teacher of directing. So Columbia University has a very, very fine directing program. Its most recent and most illustrious graduate is our very own Darko Tresnik, who was trained in, were you there then when he was there?
No, I came just after.
Just after. So, it's a very, very fine program. And one of the issues that I struggle with, and when I meet artistic directors of Shakespeare theaters around the country, of which there are a dozen major ones, we talk about where are we going to get directors from. I'm blessed to be able to have Brian's phone number because here's a guy who has done big outdoor Shakespeare with major actors at a very, very high level. The list of people who've done that is short. The list of women who've done that is teeny. The list of artists of color who've done that is practically non-existent. So as a theater producer and as the steward of a nonprofit arts institution with a public service mission, I feel that an obligation to somehow expand the ranks of Shakespeare directors, period, of Shakespeare directors who are women and artists of color. And I require the training provided by you to create a pipeline to bring those people into the world, or I don't know where to find them. We are doing our Globe for All program out in the community, and we're finding that that's a great place to introduce ourselves to new directors, but the leap from there to the festival stage is a big one. So what are you finding in the world of young directors? Are there people who are waking up at age 20-something and saying, what I want to be is a Shakespeare director?
Yes.
Are there?
Yeah.
That's good to know.
No, I have very good news to pass on to you.
Good.
The next couple generations of directors are going to be stupendous, and you're already getting to see some of them. Rachel Chafkin is a great example.
Yeah. Is she a student of yours?
She's a student of mine.
Wow.
And Anne's, but she came fully formed, so we can't take it.
No, well.
But Rachel did.
She did the Royale here,
and she's going to do.
And
another.
she's coming back to do a play called Red Velvet next season. Yeah.
And she is prodigious with Shakespeare.
Yes.
And when we were doing The Tempest, Mandy Patinkin wanted to coach, so I had Rachel, and she was just worked wonders with him. The next generation, I think, is. I'm so impressed. I'm so thrilled with what I'm seeing come through, both in terms of artists of color, women directors. I think it's going to be. I think the next 20, 30 years are going to be really thrilling. This new generation is very passionate. The sort of irony that was my generation was very ironic. I think my class motto was "We can, we will, if we want to." I think that was, But what I'm seeing is people who are really concerned about the world, concerned about connecting with audiences, concerned about the fact that the world may not resemble itself. That in 30 or 40 years, the world that we know may be completely different in ways that is going to impact on the lives of our children and our children's children. And it's given them a real mission, a real sense of there's art can help talk about the issues that need to be addressed.
And they want to express these things through Shakespeare.
Through theater and through Shakespeare.
And through Shakespeare. So Shakespeare hasn't been...
No, you would think that that's not the case. But I also, you realize because of the Old Globe, because of the Guthrie, because of Washington Shakes, because of Chicago Shakes, because of Iowa Shakes, because of every Shakes, children, young people are growing up with the language of Shakespeare, and that was not the case when I was growing up. In Los Alamitos, you'd have to come to San Diego to do that. There wasn't a Los Alamitos Shakes, and my family couldn't conceive of coming down.
Right.
Just beyond their ken.
Well, I appreciate that optimistic report about
that.
That's great.
I think it's exciting.
How many are you training?
We do 6 a year.
6 a year in a 3-year program?
3-year program.
That's great. And they all do Shakespeare?
They all, in the final year, do Shakespeare.
Do they have the scholarly bent of people like you and me?
Some, Rachel, yes, very much so, yeah.
That's
fantastic.
fantastic.
A lot, yeah, no, it's the Shakespeare literacy and theater literacy in young people today. Shockingly, you would think it would not be the case, is much higher, I think, than when I was a student.
And are they getting work when they get out of school?
Columbia is a sort of like based on Emerson's self-reliance. They just sort of go out and they start making things. They don't wait to be hired. They just found a company and start making stuff. That's how Rachel started.
Yeah.
And so they're just being discovered in garages in Brooklyn, in Williamsburg, making these things that suddenly are on the cover of the arts and leisure section of the New York Times.
Yeah, remarkable. Times is sending their reporters to Brooklyn, which is
yeah.
the thing that they certainly weren't doing that when I was coming up, Well, Brian, what a absolute pleasure. My God, I could talk to you. And we will, because we're going to go have dinner. So we're going to talk more, but these folks aren't going to be able to be with us. So ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank Brian for being here. Let me turn over the remaining time that we have to you and see if there are any questions. Yes, sir.
Well, on the subject of inclusivity and the way that theater is changing and embracing other voices, I wonder if both of you could talk a little bit about the trend of race-blind casting, particularly in Shakespeare. My own students, when I would take them, they'll kind of push back and ask about that. They'll say, you wouldn't see a Waifus Falstaff or an octogenarian Hamlet or a 20-something Lear usually, right? Because it would seem inauthentic or distracting. So why is it that we will see people of every color on stage?
So the question, let me just repeat the question for everybody. And back in here is about colorblind casting in Shakespeare and how we integrate the companies with ethnicities and maybe even body types and genders that are different from those that appear to be the ones written in the text.
To me, the great thing about theater is metaphor, and so like I get very excited when I had the opportunity to see a production of Romeo and Juliet where the Romeo and Juliet were in their 70s. It was so moving. And at first, it's the theatrical experience. You first see it, you go, this is not going to work. This is so wrong in so many ways. And then slowly, your mind and then suddenly you're in it and it makes absolute sense and the wrinkles disappear and it's love and it's about love and it's about love. So I think that's, especially in Shakespeare, you can have, I remember we did a Hamlet and everyone went, oh, your Hamlet's very old. He can't be that old. And you for 2 seconds you go, he's a little older than other Hamlets. And then suddenly this magical thing happens where you fall into it. And so I never have that problem. I actually court it in a way.
Yeah, what I will say, especially just given where I was last night and the ultimate coronation, if it were possible to coronate it any more than it's already been coronated of Hamilton. I mean, last night the dance number, the number that they did from Hamilton was introduced by Barack and Michelle Obama, and you're like, that's all you could get? Like you couldn't get God to come and introduce the thing? Here's what I will say. People are asking me, well, what's the real influence of Hamilton going to be? And it's going to be the normalization of that. You know, that you go see that show, and Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and Alexander Hamilton and all those people are just who they are. And the whole political point of it is that the story of America is a polyglot, multi-ethnic, multiracial story. I had the exact converse experience, because I'm going to indulge in a little bit of Brit bashing. I was in New York a month ago when the Royal Shakespeare Company was in town with their much vaunted productions of Henry IV. They did Richard II, Henry IV Parts 1 and 2, and Henry V. Maybe they even went through the Henry VI.
They
did all 8 of them. It's one of the rituals of the Royal Shakespeare Company for generations has been that a new artistic director is expected unofficially to do the Henry plays as a kind of position statement. And if you look back over the history of that company, that's been true of all of them. Whenever they come in, they do them. So Trevor Nunn, in the 70s, he did his in modern dress. And what that signaled to everybody was that this great story of the founding legend of England, like the Hamilton is of the American founding legend, we're going to put it in modern dress at the Royal Shakespeare Company, and this was a shocking thing. Michael Boyd, when he did it, he cast a black English actor as King Henry VI and signaled the priority of inclusivity in his Royal Shakespeare Company. Well, the new guy has done this, what the wags are calling a heritage production. It's perfect period. It is a throwback. I felt like I was sitting in 1952. All white. The only actors of color are playing servants. You know, it just felt like I wanted to buy him a ticket to Hamilton. So I think that what you're going to see, and certainly you see it in our practice at the Old Globe, is that we're just saying, hey, we live in San Diego, in one of the most diverse metropolises in the United States. Those demographics have to be reflected in our theater and in our Shakespeare theater in particular, which is the jewel of our crown. And I think the Hamilton effect is going to be the normalization of that and the removal of the problematic that has been so troublesome to people. That's my prediction. We'll see whether I'm right. You know? Yes, in the back. That's cool.
Thank you so much. We're going to see Macbeth on July 7th. We're super excited.
Oh, great.
So this is a small group, right? We're all friends here. We won't tell anyone. You'll give me a little bit of your secret story.
What's the secret story of Macbeth? Oh my goodness. You know, I think it's slowly emerging. It's very elliptical, but I think Macbeth is really about, and you're going to think I'm insane, it's about the erosion of language. I think Macbeth is about when we can't communicate with one another. And that the great tragedy is that we see Lady M and Mr. M, and they can complete each other's thoughts. The first moment you see them, they don't even have to finish a sentence. The other one knows. But by the end of the play, they might as well be on separate continents speaking 2 different languages. The whole play to me is about how language, when you abuse language, you abuse relationships, you abuse society. When language and deeds get pulled apart in such a way, it's the beginning of the end. And so all the obfuscation, all of the equivocations, all of that. How language is used, and how we buy into language. You know, interestingly, when James Shapiro came to see the show, we were talking about the Bloody Sergeant. It's a very difficult part of the play. The Bloody Sergeant he's dying, but he has all this glorious language. And it's very hard to understand why Shakespeare, who's so smart, would do that. Because a person who's dying would just be using little fragments of language. But I think what Shakespeare is trying to signal is this man has bought into a rhetoric of war, a glorification of war. And in the same way that Macbeth buys into the witch's ideas of being a leader and that sort of thing. And both men are undone by a language that they buy into that ultimately destroys their body and soul. And so I think the big discussion that's really going on in Macbeth is how the state uses language, how that language infects the populace, and how the populace, like a virus, that language starts to eat away at our civility and our ability to live with one another. Well, that's the thing is I think, now that may not be what it's really about, but because that's very much what's happening in our world, that starts to bubble up in the Shakespeare text.
I might have to tell my husband he's going to see the play, but otherwise.
Secret is safe here. Yes, sir.
I have a question about how you tailor your productions towards audiences, specifically socioeconomic levels of audiences. You both directed at the Globe, where the tickets are kind of expensive, and then direct free productions like Globe for All and Public Theater. And do you make adjustments for those different types of audiences?
Good question. You want to start?
I'd love to hear.
All right. Yeah. Well, one of the strange things I encountered when I came here from New York 4 years ago was that the outdoor Shakespeare isn't free. In New York, it is. I'll tell you on the record. We sell about $2 million worth of tickets every summer to Shakespeare. If some philanthropist wanted to give me $2 million, I'd make the tickets free. It's just as simple as that. They're expensive to produce. The institution is expensive to run, all of that, and so the tickets cover the cost. At the Globe, statistically, the box office covers about 65% of our institution, and the other 35% comes from philanthropy. So the more philanthropy comes in, the less we have to charge for tickets. It's pretty basic math, and we can talk about, cutting the institution size and paying people less, all that other stuff. But essentially, that's the way the nonprofit theater works. If I could get one of the great philanthropists of San Diego to do that, I'd make our Shakespeare free. After that, I don't believe there's any difference between how you approach Shakespeare. Where there is a difference is I know, and Brian and I have been in conversation about that, we have a theater at the Globe. We're blessed to have a theater where a lot of people are seeing Shakespeare for the first time. Certainly when we do Globe for All out in the community, we know for a fact that these audiences, the homeless, senior citizens, refugee centers, correctional facilities where we play, 90% of that audience is seeing live theater for the first time, and certainly Shakespeare for the first time. But at our outdoor theater, it's a place where a family will bring their 10 or 12 or 13-year-old kid to see Shakespeare for the very first time. It's one of the Globe's glories is that it is the place where this region of California meets Shakespeare for the first time. So when it comes to sexual content, when it comes to a certain kind of explicit violence, when it comes to those kind of questions of, let's call them community values, sensitivities and sensibilities, that's where that conversation becomes intense. Other than that, no. We do the Shakespeare play as we respond to it, for whomever the audience is. But since I know there are going to be a lot of young people around there, I always engage directors in conversation about those kind of issues that let's say for which you would give it an R rating. I try and run that outdoor festival stage as a PG or a PG-13 environment. Other than that, it's really about, as a director, you're acting as a proxy for the audience and trying to make the story as clear as you possibly can. Not for a rich audience or a poor audience, or an educated audience or a less educated audience, but for an audience in the broadest sense. And that's the position I sort of sit myself in. And hope that the audience, whoever they are, will respond to things because I respond to them. That's the basic principle. There's a great, I'm going to quote my own Bulgarian, a director named Boris Zakhov. You ever hear of Zakhov?
No, I haven't.
Yeah. He wrote a wonderful essay about the practice of theater directing called An Audience of One, in which he expanded this idea that that's what a director is. Director is one person sitting there representing, during the rehearsal process, that audience of hundreds or thousands or whatever. Your own sensibility becomes a proxy for the mass audience. Hope that answers your question. Brian, you want to add to that?
From a slightly other angle, of the audience. You know, one of the things that I find most exciting about working at the Delacorte is how mixed the audience actually is, and that, you know, in my world nowadays, you know, people read the same newspaper, they see this, they watch TV shows, everything, they can choose their own reality. Do you know what I'm saying? So my parents can choose a conservative reality, I can choose a liberal reality, and I can just live in that bubble. The extraordinary thing about theater and Shakespearean theater is it gathers people who are genuinely curious from all segments of conservative, liberal, different backgrounds, different ethnicities, and they all can come together and they can all cry together over something that's meaningful to them. So for me, one of the most exciting things about America is when you can get a mixed audience in and remind them that we all aren't that different from one another. That we all, you know, that things that are important, there are universals that transcend class, that transcend gender, that speak to everyone, and it reconnects us with another kind of one, if that makes sense. And that's the most magical thing in the world. This is what Joe Papp, I think, was able to accomplish by making Shakespeare available to everyone. And you suddenly sitting with people that you wouldn't necessarily have the opportunity to sit with. And then suddenly you're laughing at the same thing. It suddenly creates a different kind of social cement. Makes you feel better, makes you feel like more of a human being at the end of the evening.
I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much. Terrific, Brian. That was
Thank
great.
you so much.
It was really
Nice.
It was really great to. It was really fun. Wonderful. Smart and erudite. It was great. No, thank you.
You know,
I'm gonna have to. Can you pop the head of the mic off? I don't think it's really. Oh, there you go.